Hello and welcome to Conflict of Interest, a presentation by Solutions IRB. My name is Cassidy Nosecable, and I'm pretty new to the IRB world too, so we'll be learning this together. So what exactly is a conflict of interest? A conflict of interest, as far as we're concerned, is when any member of the research team or their families have the potential to benefit or lose, financially or otherwise, from the research project. These come in all shapes and sizes, and they can be major or just a minor conflict. But regardless of how big or small they are, all conflict of interest need to be reported to the IRB in order to protect the interests of the participants. That's our job. That's why IRBs exist, is to protect participants in human research. We can't do that if we don't have all the information, so it's really important to report these COIs as they come up to the IRB. Now, having a really strong conflict of interest management plan in place will also protect you as the research team. So again, it's just really important to report these, and we can work together to make sure that these are being mitigated properly. And don't be afraid of a conflict of interest. They're really, really common, and it's just important to report them to us. That way we can make sure that they've been managed appropriately. Now, not only is it important to address conflicts of interest because you need IRB approval for your study, but there's also federal guidelines in place about conflicts of interest. And the federal guidelines require careful consideration and assurance that all conflicts of interest that might impact the welfare of the participants in your research project, that all these conflicts of interest have been identified and been mitigated, minimized, or completely eliminated. Reporting of financial interest is required from all individuals involved in the research, including the PI, co-PIs, research assistants, research coordinators, and their families. Again, this is all part of the federal guidelines regarding these, so not only is it important for your IRB application, but it's also important to be following federal regulations. Now, I mentioned that conflicts of interest come in all shapes and sizes, and we'll go over a couple examples of those, but first I wanted to talk about major versus minor conflicts of interest. Something really important to note is that you, as the researcher, do not actually get to decide if your conflict of interest is major or minor. That's our job as the IRB. We'll determine that for you, so you don't need to worry too much. But an example of a major conflict of interest would be an interest of 10% or more, or if it's a really small company, $10,000 or more in the company in the research project. A minor conflict of interest might just be your PI is employed by the company that is funding the research and that the research is about, or small ownership shares. So again, these come in a lot of shapes and sizes. There's a lot of gray area, and that's why the IRB is the one that ultimately will determine if these are major conflicts or minor conflicts. The most common conflict of interest that we see are financial conflicts, but there's also non-financial conflicts of interest that might appear in your study. Some examples of those might be having a doctor recruit and consent participants for the study that they're running. If I'm going to the doctor's office and my doctor says, "Hey, I'm doing a study, do you want to sign up for it?" Because that person is an authoritarian role, that might cause some undue influence and maybe even potentially coercion in some of these cases. So just making sure you're aware of that and that you have some mitigation plans in place if you are having some sort of authoritarian, like a teacher or a doctor, recruit and consent participants from within their practice or students. Some examples of financial conflicts of interest, like we talked about earlier, are just the researcher gaining financially from the outcome. Maybe you've invented an app and that's what the research is about, and if your app goes well and the research goes well, you could gain significantly. That would be a conflict of interest that we'll need to mitigate throughout the study. Conflicts of interest come in all shapes and sizes, but so do their mitigation techniques. Some techniques you might come across if you have a major conflict of interest could be as simple as just public disclosure of the financial interest of your investigators, or it could be as major as reformulating or modifying your entire study to avoid that conflict of interest. Other examples include double-blind data analysis, disclosure in the informed consent forms and directly disclosing that to your participants. It could be using other researchers in the study to obtain consent from your participants, especially in those cases when it is an authoritarian figure and there's a potential for undue influence. So again, if it's a teacher running the research and they want to recruit from their own students, maybe you have someone else from the study team do that recruitment, someone that does not interact with those students on a day-to-day basis and is not considered an authoritarian figure. That would be a good way to mitigate that kind of conflict of interest. You could also bring in independent reviewers and have them do your data analysis and interpretation. And in extreme cases, you might want to either completely remove an investigator from the study or at least from part of the project where their major conflict of interest could really derail things. For minor conflicts of interest, it's a little bit easier to mitigate. So for example, if the minor conflict of interest is that all of the study team works for the company that the research is about, who is also the company that's funding the research, you'll just want to provide evidence that your research team's jobs at that company are not dependent on the outcomes of this research. You could also just need to disclose in your consent forms and in publications that this is a conflict of interest. If the participants are okay with participating, knowing that conflict of interest, you're good to go. And again, these come in all shapes and sizes, and we are more than willing to help you navigate this gray area of the IRB world. Some additional considerations to keep in mind when you're thinking about your conflicts of interest are that we at Solutions IRB require that all study staff complete trainings on COIs. We also typically require that all study staff complete a human subjects training course, and that usually covers the COI basics that we require. But if your study does have a very significant or major COI, we would recommend that you and your staff complete a COI specific training to just make sure everybody is aware on how to approach a conflict of interest. If you develop a conflict of interest after your study has been approved by the IRB, you'll want to submit an amendment to us within 30 days. This really goes for any changes going on with your study. You'll need to submit an amendment, but definitely for these conflicts of interest, we need to know about it because we can't help you mitigate it if we have no idea that it happens. And it could just cause some problems further down the line if you don't report it. Another thing that you'll want to consider is that if you do have a conflict of interest, you're going to want to check with your study sponsor or funder to see if they have any special requirements and special ways that that conflict of interest needs to be reported to them. Because we would hate to see you lose your funding because we didn't know you needed to report it. So definitely check with them if a COI does come up. Another important note is that if conflict of interest noncompliance occurs with an NIH-funded study, we as the IRB have to report this noncompliance to the NIH. So again, just make sure that you are giving us all the information up front. Conflicts of interest are really common. This is something we see in a large portion of the studies, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's really hard to avoid a conflict of interest. Just be sure to report them to us and mitigate them appropriately, and then they won't be an issue. Thank you so much for watching today, and if you have any questions about conflicts of interest or anything really to do with your study submission to Solutions IRB, feel free to visit solutionsirb.com for more info, or you can reach out to us at correspondence@solutionsirb.com, or even give us a call at 855-226-4472. We look forward to working with you.